Thanks, Christine. I'll also introduce Dr. Mick Battam from AgEnviro Solutions, who's going to kick things off. Mick's a soil scientist and was the brains behind a lot of the work we did initially.
Okay, cool. Everyone hear me okay? Now we're talking, I just want to acknowledge that we've got some projects that are sponsored by the EPA Waste Less, Recycle More scheme. And we're talking today about, actually, do I need to speak into the mic? Is that all right?
Yes, you need to, because it's being recorded.
Sorry, no worries. This is composted garden organics that's gone onto a sporting field. There's been no irrigation or anything like that. This is how many days later?
About a week.
And you can see the grass absolutely goes nuts. It loves it. So we're going to talk about using compost on sporting fields, basically. So to do this, I want to talk about the condition of our sporting fields and how compost can help. And then Paul's going to do some cost comparisons. A little bit of background about myself. Soil scientists are a bit different to everybody else. We're not greenkeepers. We're idiots that dig holes in the middle of paddocks and that kind of stuff. In this case here, we're trying to see where the water goes from a drip irrigation system. There's a buried dripper in there, and we were trying to predict where it went, and it turned out digging a hole was the best way to find it. Because if you got the spacing wrong between the drippers in the dry areas in New South Wales, it just salinised everything. So a bit of a different sort of scenario. I was lucky enough to be involved in writing a program called Love Your Garden, and we surveyed and gave advice on water savings and horticultural advice to 26,000 houses. I didn't do them all, and that's not me when I was younger, obviously. I'm far better looking than that. So what we found over and over again is just how important the soils are. But it's interesting, they got away with it for 18 months. It was when it finally got dry and they weren't allowed to irrigate, essentially out it came. Over the years, worked on some pretty cool sites, Renwick Racecourse, those sorts of sites, Barangaroo, and was involved in writing or wrote most of the best practices guideline for turf, which is a freebie you can get off the web. And whilst I do golf courses and parks, I'm really going to concentrate on sporting fields today. And I've surveyed about 1,400. I'm going to concentrate on just 844 of them. Okay, so let's talk about the condition of the 844 sporting fields. Okay, so I assessed 844 sporting fields. That's why I'm so trim. I'm digging holes in them and that kind of stuff. And anything that had reasonably good turf cover, but was worn out where the goalie stands, you can see where the goalie's standing there, that was acceptable. I called that an acceptable field. And 20% of fields out of those 844 were actually in pretty good nick. Now, even if you had decent turf cover, I would still fail a field if it was very uneven or very hard or very poor drainage. But we're just mostly focusing on turf cover, okay? So 1 in 5 sporting fields were in good nick. What do you reckon about the other 4 in 5? Okay, so 35% are marginal, and you can see I'm being a bit generous by calling this marginal, aren't I? You don't want to play footy on it, but essentially you can, okay? Now that leaves 25% that were poor, okay? That's not real good, but there are some special 10% that were really not so good at all. How many of you think this field needs an irrigation system? Well, it probably does, doesn't it? But if you look closely, can you see the tank up there? It actually already has an irrigation system. This is what happens when you get the soil wrong and you get the turf cultivar wrong. Absolute disaster. On the plus side, they didn't have to use much line marking paint that year. Okay. Now what I've got here is a plot of a whole heap of different councils, and I've plotted what fields were poor and very poor, okay? And you can see, say for instance, the first one there, Northern Beaches, there were 48 fields and about 50% of them were in bad or very bad nick. You sort of get the picture of what's going on here. So what I've done though is plotted on this end all the councils that had very intensely used fields. And down the other end are all the councils in a lot of the country areas that have fairly low levels of use. And if you stand back and look at the plot, I was expecting to find all the bad fields up this end where all the intense usage is. In fact, there's bad fields everywhere because it's not overuse that's causing the problems. Take this field here, for example. This one's in the Sutherland sort of area, and you can see it's ripped to shreds. It's obviously damaged by foot traffic, right? But foot traffic is not the problem here. It gets about 24 hours a week of gameplay, but when you adjust for the fact that they're juniors, they've only got one team at once training, and you put it through a wear calculator, it gets the equivalent wear of 10 hours per week of 2 adult teams playing soccer, okay? I know it's a league field, but it gets that equivalent wear, okay? It's not a high wear field, and yet, because of the layering problems in the soil, the grass doesn't bite in, and so when they run on it, they just rip it to shreds. So this is what it looked like at the end of one season. We did some very minor amendment works on this low use field, and the following season, at the end of the following season, it looked like that. You can see what a dramatic difference the soil amendment has made, and that was only about $6,000 worth of amendment. Very, very simple. It's a low use field. Okay, so that's the condition of the fields. Most of them are in a mess. How can compost help? Well, what does turf want? Turf wants an NPK ratio of about 9:1 to somewhere about 5 or 7. They don't know exactly how much potassium they actually need, okay? And if you take chicken manure, which is what everybody thinks is good for their lawn, look at the NPK ratio of it. It doesn't match the turf very well, does it? It's not the only manure, of course. There's a whole heap of others. The black and white one there, that's the cow manure. And it makes sense that cow manure would have a chemistry similar to that of grass, because cows are eating grass, fully digesting the grass, and so their poo would be somewhat similar to chemistry to grass. But of course, that's only these types of organics. There are other types of organics. And here we have seaweed meal, which everybody says is so good for your lawn. It's not really good. And composted garden organics. Look at how well it fits. And again, it makes sense. You're taking vegetation, you're composting it. Who would have thought that composted vegetation would have a chemistry similar to that with what vegetation wants? It makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. But it's not just the NPK. So when we talk about composted garden organics, we're talking about that stuff there. Goes through, it's got a bit of rubbish in it. Somebody goes through and picks it out. Goes through a shredder, gets composted, goes through a trommel, meets Australian standard, and out she comes like that, okay? It's weed free, it's been screened, 8 mil if you're going to put it on top, and the coarser stuff you can put underneath. And it's got a very high infiltration rate. Now, what compost does the most, though, is not its nutrients. Everybody thinks it's nutrients. It's not. It's what it does to the soil structure. We've all seen soils like this, yeah? I break shovels in soils like this. They're not bricks. They're concrete slabs often what we're dealing with, okay? And the council runs it over with a slicer and they think it's aerating the soil. Often it isn't. Often all they're doing is cutting it up into bricks, okay? This is not sodic. It's not going to respond to gypsum, this particular soil. It needs organic matter. All the farmers know it. The sporting field managers need to get the message as well. And that's where the composted garden organics comes in. So this field here, this gets 20 hours of weighted wear, okay? It actually gets about 40 hours of actual wear time. But by the time you sort of adjust for how many players are training and that kind of stuff, it gets 20. This is a medium use field, okay? And you see they've destroyed it. So we blackabate it in some compost and let the turf recover. So just let the turf recover from the sprigs in the ground. And the following season, this is what it looked like at the end of the season. And you can see it's obviously worn, but it's done it without too much hassle. Okay, this is a field that got rebuilt. This is a high use field. It says 35, but in fact it's about 50-something, 60-something hours of a week of booked usage. And it comes down to the equivalent wear of 35 hours per week of 2 adult teams playing footy. They are playing soccer. They've built this field and 6 months later it looks like this. You can see that's high use now, can't you? What do you think the community does the moment they see that? They want a synthetic field, which is an absolute crime. Had they have built it correctly, it would have handled it. This field here gets 35 hours per week of wear. And you can see, I know it's dull coloured because it's winter, it's couch that's gone dull coloured, but it's handled the wear. And that's what it looks like in the last week of the soccer season. It's easily handled the wear. Okay? And you come to spring, and it looks like this, without any turf patching. It's just come straight back. And so 85% of fields in the Sydney area, so where it's more intensely used, get less use than this field, less intense use than this field. And you can see it handles it easy. Okay, I'll give it to Paul to do the economics.
Okay. It's a bit of fun. This is what I do in my spare time, is play around with budgets and costs and the like. And also talk a little bit about the end. In the end, we've got some grants for councils. Okay, so this is the low use field Mick mentioned earlier. Needed irrigating twice a week, now needs irrigating every 10 days. So it's 2 megs a year, 4 grand of water, 2 grand of fertiliser and herbicide, 6 grand a year. They're saving. It costs about that much to do it, so there's a payback of that in a year or so. The moderate use field, you can see the irrigation regime. We're saving 10 grand a year, so we're looking at payback with that one in about 5 or 6 years. The rates vary with the contractors, so you've just got to really watch your contractors and what they get up to, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So really what we're looking at to transform our fields, we need compost and we need a bucket of money. So the club wants synthetic, Mick mentioned before. You build it correctly, you end up with something like that. That's where the goalkeeper stands. That's the worst place on the paddock. That'll come back over summer. If we jump on the next one, here's the killer with the costs. The synthetic, this is per hectare, and this is a 20-year life costing analysis. So we go through and look at the cost for every year, discount it back to today's dollars so you can compare like for like. The synthetic comes in somewhere north about $2.4 million a hectare. A well-built natural turf field, you're looking at around $600,000 a hectare. So you can rebuild 4 fields properly for the price of 1 synthetic field. So I wouldn't know a ratepayer that wouldn't jump at that. But it's actually convincing the clubs and the community that synthetic is not all it's cracked up to be, particularly when it comes to the cost side of it and the future rates that the community is going to have to wear. And we haven't even factored heat island effect and those sorts of other things into the mix with that as well. On a 30-degree day in Newcastle, in April, the synthetic's too hot to play soccer on, they're cancelling bookings. This is in April, it's 30 degrees. It's not insane, it's not 35, it's not 37. And Mick's done some measurements, and on summer day, it's 70 degrees on the synthetic. The bitumen road was 65. So then the next question is, well, do you build it properly or do you build it on the cheap? The contractors are very good at this. Oh, look, if you take the compost out, if you change the turf cultivar, if you use this soil instead of that soil, you can do it cheaper, but you will pay. And we've got an example out the back where they did all of that. They changed everything out, and now council's left with a water bill of 50 grand in their first year, compared to what it would have been about 20 odd if they'd done it properly in the first place. That then put the pressure on the water utility. So it's an ongoing cost because the water utility is then looking at their demands and going, we need to augment our next source. What's it going to be? New dam or desal plant? So there are other ways that these decisions being made in the construction process are filtering costs through to the community in the long term. So here, if we look over time, we start cheaper with the cheap build, but then its cost curve rises faster because we've got to spend more on water, we've got to spend more on fertilisers, we've got to spend more on maintenance. And this is a relatively moderate use field, so at about year 9, we're break even, and beyond that, we're in front, having actually invested properly in the build in the first place. This field has been rebuilt twice in 10 years using traditional techniques, no compost, the soil's bad, no amount of water is going to save that thing now. The club will scream and say, we want synthetic. Third time lucky, they build it properly, and look what they've got. They've got a community that's happy, they've got a club that's happy, they've got a groundsman that's actually proud to present this field for community use. Yeah, and that's halfway through soccer season, so it's doing well. The high use fields, that payback comes back even faster because they're not wearing it out. So this time we're looking at about 5 years. This is the one Mick mentioned before, within 12 months. So much depends on your soils and your situation as to what your paybacks are going to be. And then we haven't even factored in climate change yet. This is what's happening to our irrigation demand over time, and you can see the stepwise change at the back end. This is actual stuff that's happening now. This is not 20 years down the track. We're looking at a 20% increase, which is why it's so crucial to get the compost into the soils so that they can capture the rainfall and the turf can hold up. So a couple of grants for councils. New South Wales EPA, we've got Organics Market Development grants out. If you need to get your field fixed, talk to Dr. Mick. He's got a subsidised grant program to assess the fields, and so you can get recommendations on how to fix them, and you can go to the contractors with a fixed plan. If you've had an assessment done and you've got no cash, come and see me, because that's when we can help you develop a business case to get the funding from the various parts of council or externally for grant projects. This is what I did at Lake Mac. 5 or 6 years on the trot, getting cash to actually fix fields up through council's budget process. So those grants are supported by the New South Wales EPA. So in my case, it won't cost you anything, but anyone that contributes, that means there's more business cases we can develop. The council's mix is heavily subsidised. There is a small co-contribution for his. So that's it. Are there any questions?